and the GRE is offered on a infinite rolling basis. Girl, are you back? You're back. We're gonna keep going with her here. Hey y'all, thanks for joining me for the second video in my law school admission series. This video is going to be about my process in taking the GRE in place of the LSAT. I'm going to talk about whether I think the GRE was easier than the LSAT and whether I think it impacted my admissions process. If you want to go to law school, you have to take some type of standardized test. And until recently, the LSAT, or the law school admissions test, had a full-blown monopoly on that process. In 2017, Harvard Law School was the first school to allow the GRE to be taken in place of the LSAT. The GRE is a standardized test that you take when you're applying to graduate programs, like a master's program or a PhD program. What's really interesting is that it started out with about 15 to 20 schools, and over the past 3 years, it's grown to about 60 schools. To add to that, 14 of the top 20 top-tier law schools accept the GRE in place of the LSAT. Now, let's talk about differences between the two tests. The LSAT consists of 3-ish scored sections. The first is logic reasoning, the second is logic games, and the third is reading comprehension. Logic reasoning is basically philosophy analytic questions. It's gonna have things like assumptions, inferences, or necessary and sufficient clauses, and so on. Logic games is pretty much fancy word puzzles, and reading comprehension is self-explanatory. The GRE also consists of 3-ish scored sections. The first two are going to be writing, the others are going to be verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning. You'll have 2 sections of each. Verbal reasoning is going to be vocabulary and reading comprehension, similar to the LSAT. Quantitative reasoning is going to be math, and writing is writing. A pretty big similarity between these two tests, and likely for any standardized test, is the fact that they're very dependent on reading comprehension. So if you're good at reading, you'll likely do well on both of these tests, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't study for them. You should definitely study for them. They're hard, they may seem intimidating at first, but the material's very learnable. So let's continue our compare and contrast. When it comes to sitting down for the actual test, for the LSAT, you'll sit for 5 multiple choice sections and 1 unscored writing section. For the GRE, you'll sit for also 5 multiple choice sections, but 2 scored writing sections. Each test, the GRE and the LSAT, has something called a research or experimental section. It's basically a multiple choice section that you'll have to take, but it's not going to show up in your final score report. So when you are scored on the LSAT, you'll be scored on 2 logic reasoning sections, 1 logic game section, and 1 reading comprehension section. For the GRE, you'll be scored on 2 writing, 2 reading comprehension, and 2 quantitative reasoning. So in terms of questions and timing, the LSAT will give you 24 to 28 questions per section, with about 35 minutes to solve each section. The GRE, you'll have 20 questions per multiple choice section. For the verbal reasoning, they'll give you 30 minutes to solve, and for the quantitative reasoning, they'll give you 35 minutes to solve. If I remember correctly, you'll also have 35 minutes for each writing section. The score range for the LSAT goes between 120 and 180. For the GRE, that's 130 to 170. But the average score for each test is around 150. Back in the day when I took the LSAT, it was a paper-based test, but now both the LSAT and the GRE are computer-delivered. The total amount of time to finish the GRE is going to be about 30 to 40 minutes longer than it'll be to take the LSAT, and the reason for that is because the GRE has an extra writing section that you have to sit for. Both tests are going to give you break time. For the LSAT, I believe it's 15 minutes, and for the GRE, it's 10 minutes. Now let's get into the pretty big differences. One of them is going to be on the number of times each test is offered per year. The LSAT is offered about 7-ish times per year. Girl, are you back? You're back. The GRE is offered on an infinite rolling basis, which means that if you want to take it on a random Tuesday or Friday or Saturday, you can take it whenever you'd like. If you take the LSAT during the academic school year, you can pretty much only take it at 8:30 a.m. If you take it during the summer, you can take it at 12:30. Now, again, similar to when the GRE is offered, the times that you choose to take the GRE are offered on a rolling, pretty much infinite basis. But here's where things get tricky. Because the LSAT is only offered a certain number of times a year, she's meowing so loud. Because the LSAT is only offered a limited number of times per year, the testing sites tend to fill up really quickly. So what that means is that if you want to take the LSAT, you pretty much need to know that you're going to take it 2 to 3 months in advance, versus the GRE where it's a little more fluid and you can decide maybe the week before you take the test that you're going to take the test. Also, if you're a morning person and you want to take the LSAT, good for you. But if your brain isn't at its optimal functions at that time, you're gonna be SOL unless you take the LSAT in the summertime. The GRE is offered, like I said, at a range of times, so you can pretty much choose what works best for you. So let's talk about testing content differences. So the GRE, like I said, has a math section and reading comprehension. The math section is pretty tough because if you're like me, you haven't looked at a lot of math since your freshman year in college. So I had to go back and look at material that I hadn't thought about in about 8 years. Another downside is the verbal section, which focuses on a lot of vocabulary. And I'm not talking about the stuff that you can learn from context clues. I'm talking about things that are currently getting dusty in the dictionary that no one says anymore. So I had to use a lot of flashcards to get through this section, and it requires quite a bit of memorization. With the LSAT, the test is mostly reading heavy, with the exception of the logic games section. But what's tricky about that section on its own is that if you don't set up your question correctly, it can throw off your answers for that entire section. So is the GRE better than the LSAT? To that I'd say yes and no. The logistics around the GRE, meaning that you get to choose what time of day that you take it and choosing to take it at a time when you know you're ready and have your highest scores, makes it inherently easier. I also think it eliminates a lot of anxiety to get your test scores immediately. Now, in terms of studying, I actually did better on the GRE than I did on the LSAT, but that's not for the reasons that you'd think. I actually studied a lot more for the GRE than I did for the LSAT. So do law schools prefer the LSAT or the GRE? And right now, because not many schools accept GRE scores compared to the number of schools that accept LSAT scores, I would say they largely... Honey, please. So do law schools prefer the LSAT or the GRE? So the only reason I'm gonna say they prefer the LSAT is because there's a higher number of schools currently that accept the LSAT than schools that accept the GRE. Now, will that change over time? Very possibly, yes. Also note that if you've taken both the LSAT and the GRE, a lot of schools require you to send all of your scores for both tests. So it's not like you can pick and choose, oh, I did better on the GRE and I'm gonna send only those scores. They wanna see all of them. So do I think the GRE hurt my admissions chances? The answer to that is maybe, but I wouldn't have the answer to that. I got into a top tier school and I got a merit-based scholarship for 2/3 of my tuition. I feel extremely lucky to have that. Do I think I could have gotten better if I took in the LSAT? I'm not entirely sure. But I also want to be upfront. I was waitlisted for every other school that I applied to, and that hurt. Now, do I think that was because I took the GRE? Possibly. But is it also possible that a lot of law schools had larger wait lists this year than they did in previous years because they were afraid that students wouldn't come to their schools because of coronavirus? That's also possible. All I have to say is that I'm really happy with my non-LSAT results, and if I had to go back in time, I would do everything the exact same way that I did. So if you want to learn more about my waitlist process and which schools soft rejected me, watch my next video. I'd love to hear more in my comments below. Did you take the LSAT or the GRE to go to law school? Or which one do you plan to take, and why? Also, please let me know if I got any of this wrong. It's been a while since I've taken these tests, and my knowledge might be a bit rusty, even though I tried to make sure it was all up to date. Leave me some comments below, and I'll see you in a couple of days.